Everyone around stood in dead silence as a homeless man suddenly blocked JD Vance's path in the middle of the street, asking for a meager $1. It was a peaceful morning in the heart of New Orleans, the kind of day when the gentle early autumn sunlight filters through ancient oak branches, casting its glow on the old cobblestone streets. The air carried a hint of burnt coffee from the roadside cafes mixed with the salty aroma from the distant bay, as if reminding everyone that this city has always been an intersection between fierce vitality and quiet hidden corners. The passers-by moved with their usual rhythm, some hurrying with bulging backpacks, some dreamily gazing at the twisted iron balconies, and JD Vance, who seemed to be caught between these two currents, strolling at his own leisurely pace. He wore a light jacket with his hands tucked in his pockets, nothing particularly striking about him with his faded jeans and shoes that had yellowed with time. He blended into the crowd like any ordinary person, yet the name JD Vance was not easily forgotten. Even though he wasn't dressed in a sharp suit, he still attracted discreet glances. A few people whispered, "I saw him on the news yesterday," or "Surely he's the one from last week's article." But at that moment, he was merely a man walking past a row of tarnished wooden storefronts, deftly avoiding a few bicycles scattered along the sidewalk. Then, amid the sound of a saxophone echoing from some corner of the street, a hoarse voice abruptly cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir, could you spare me $1?" JD Vance was not unfamiliar with that plea. He had walked through enough streets like these to become accustomed to the rhythm of such requests. Usually, a slight nod or a polite shake of the head was enough, and then everything would pass by. But this time, something made his steps slow down. Perhaps it was the tremor in that voice, as if it were about to dissolve into the air, or the way the man bowed his head, not daring to look up. He was gaunt, not merely the thinness of someone lacking food, but a deep erosion etched into every line of his face. His cheeks hollowed as if sculpted away by time. His unusually large eyes peeking out from beneath a mass of disheveled hair. His clothing was a meaningful jumble, a threadbare sweater over a dingy t-shirt, trousers torn at the knees, like a vivid diary of someone forced to endure the night's cold. His scruffy beard was not a style, but a mark of neglect, while his hands were rough and cracked from the biting wind and frost. He raised no voice, nor did he push. He simply stood there, silently waiting, as if he had repeated this plea 1,000 times without daring to hope for much. Vance came to a stop and tilted his head slightly. "What is your name?" The man blinked, astonished as if he had just heard something strange. This was not part of the familiar script. Usually, either money would be thrust into his hand, or he would be brushed aside. He cleared his throat, his voice dry like rustling dry leaves. "I am Sam," he murmured, the name emerging as a reluctant confession. Vance looked at him for a moment, his eyes calm yet sharp, as if weighing something carefully. Around them, the flow of people continued, with no one paying much attention. To them, this was merely a fleeting moment between a politician and a man most chose to ignore. But there was something in Sam that made Vance pause. Perhaps it was his slightly slumped shoulders, not exactly despair, but sheer exhaustion, or the way he maintained a quiet dignity amid life's harsh currents. "Are you from around here, Sam?" Vance asked, his voice deep and polite. Sam chuckled softly, a brief, joyless laugh. "I'm wherever I can find a place, you understand," he replied, his eyes drifting far away. Vance nodded slightly, yet his hand did not reach for his wallet. Instead, he continued, "How long have you been living on the streets?" Sam shrugged, glancing at the street filled with vehicles and voices as if trying to avoid the question. "A long time," he finally said, his voice trailing off as if unwilling to delve any deeper. Vance exhaled softly, his breath mingling with the cool air of the autumn morning. He sensed a few eyes beginning to fix on him. A man leaning against a streetlight, pretending to scroll on his phone. An elderly lady with a cloth bag who halted in her tracks. And a kid in a hoodie whose eyes lit up as if watching a performance. It was unclear whether they were curious or recording, But Vance did not mind. What he said next was what truly mattered, and at that moment, the story began to take a turn. Sam slipped his hand into the pocket of his worn-out jacket, the threadbare fabric having lost its original color, now just a pale, faded gray. His fingers curled inside it, grasping at nothing, as if trying to hold onto a fragile warmth. JD Vance observed him for a while longer, his gaze composed yet full of meaning. Most politicians had probably long since walked away, or merely tossed a few coins to end the encounter quickly. But Vance did not reach for his wallet. Sam noticed a hint of disappointment on his face, as if he had become accustomed to this script 100 times. "I only need $1, he repeated, his voice even softer, as if lowering his desire might persuade Vance to change his mind. Vance did not respond immediately. He glanced down at the street, where a few people had begun to gather. The man leaning against the streetlight now openly raised his phone. The elderly lady with the cloth bag stood still, and the hoodie kid's eyes shone as if watching a play. Suddenly, the atmosphere grew as taut as a tightened string, with everyone waiting to see what JD Vance would do with this homeless man. New Orleans has a knack for turning private moments into a public stage where every eye scrutinizes. JD Vance turned back to look at Sam, his voice light yet assured. "What will you do if you have that $1? Sam let out a sound that was half a laugh, half a snort, his eyes gleaming with a hint of sarcasm. "$1 million question, isn't it?" Yet Vance did not laugh along. His face was solemn, not a trace of jest. Sam stiffened, his expression hardening at that seriousness. $1 these days can't buy much," he muttered in a lowered tone. "Maybe a small cup of coffee on the corner, or a stale loaf of bread if you know where to get it, but you know." He paused, his voice gradually softening as if whispering to the wind. "Sometimes, it's just a moment when I don't feel like trash." Those words hung between them, heavy as the damp October morning air. Not an excuse, not a plea, but a raw truth spoken from the depths of his heart. Vance tightened his jaw, his eyes sliding down to Sam's hands, still buried deep in the pockets of his ragged jacket, with thin fingers moving slightly, as if trying to clutch onto something unseen. "Have you ever had a job?" Vance asked, his tone polite yet laden with meaning. Sam gave a bitter laugh, a laugh full of acrimony. "Yeah, before life kicked me into the gutter." Vance nodded slightly, not rushing to judge. "What kind of work?" Sam hesitated, then shrugged as if unwilling to remember. "A plumber. Not some high-end gig. Just doing odd jobs around the house, fixing leaking pipes, replacing broken water heaters." He shook his head, his eyes clouded by memories. "But who would hire a man with no home, no fixed address?" Vance made no retort. He had heard stories like these before, of people whom life had pushed into dead ends so quickly they never had a chance to catch themselves. Sam rubbed his chin, his rough fingers brushing through his patchy beard. "So, in the end, are you giving me $1 or not?" A long pause followed. Vance's response made the air suddenly as taut as a string. "I have something better for you." Sam frowned, his eyes sharpening with suspicion. "Hey, I don't need your lectures, buddy." "Not lectures," Vance replied, his tone calm yet resolute. Sam looked at him, his tired eyes revealing his wariness. All around, the saxophone from some distant corner of the street seemed to quiet down, as if all of New Orleans were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Yet whatever Vance was thinking was far from simple. Sam squinted, shifting his weight from foot to foot, as if wanting to retreat. He was all too used to these scenes, conversations that began with kindness and ended with the usual ballads of self-reliance or responsibility that he had no desire to hear. He braced himself to receive the same old routine, but Vance was not at all tentative. Instead, he asked, "When was the last time someone truly gave you a chance?" Sam's eyebrows furrowed, his eyes momentarily bewildered. "What do you mean? What kind of chance? A job or something?" The question struck him like an unexpected blow. He blinked, glancing over Vance's shoulder as if trying to find the answer among the old tiled roofs in the distance. He sighed, slowly shaking his head. "It's been a long time." Vance nodded as if he had guessed it already. Have you ever tried to break out of this life? Sam shot him a look, his voice suddenly rising. You think I enjoy living on the streets? You think I chose this life? Vance remained unmoved, silently looking at him. Sam snorted, rubbing his face forcefully with his hand. I tried going into shelters, half-full ones, before I could even get in. I tried finding work. You know what they say. Come back when you have a phone number? Come back when you have an address? He laughed bitterly, a laugh devoid of any joy, as if I could just pull those things out of thin air. Vance folded his arms, listening with a rare patience. Sam shook his head, his voice lowering. Have you ever been homeless? Never, Vance replied bluntly. Sam's lips twisted into a smirk, his eyes flashing a trace of sarcasm. Yeah, I figured as much. Vance tilted his head slightly. But I have been poor. Sam looked at him, this time with a little less scorn, though suspicion still lingered. Yeah, Vance continued. I grew up in a house where the fireplace was often out, and the refrigerator held nothing but air. I know what it feels like to wear the same school clothes for days on end. Sam snorted, slapping his hand down. Yeah, but I bet you have a way out. Vance held his gaze. It took a long time. A long silence stretched between them, the air heavy like the morning fog. All around, the crowd gradually thickened. A guy in a baseball cap raised his phone, pretending to read a text, yet clearly recording. An older woman murmured something to her friend, eyes darting between Vance and Sam. Sam exhaled forcefully, his voice suddenly sharp. So you're going to stand here and preach that I have to get up on my own, that I have to try harder? Vance shook his head. No. Sam narrowed his eyes, his tone tense. Then what? Vance reached into his jacket pocket, but not for money. It was a small, folded piece of paper. He offered it. Sam looked at it, his eyes full of doubt. What's this? A name, a phone number? Vance replied. Sam did not immediately take it. For what? For someone who can help you, Vance said. Sam stared at him intently. Help how? They run a program, housing first, no strings attached. Sam snorted, his tone laced with sarcasm. Yeah, sounds great, but life isn't that easy. Vance did not lower his hand. No, it isn't easy, but it's real. Sam hesitated. He had heard enough empty promises, shelter flyers with no vacancies, phone numbers leading nowhere, charitable reassurances that amounted to nothing. He wasn't sure if this time would be any different, but there was something about Vance, the way he didn't smirk, didn't try to persuade, that made him pause. Why are you doing this? Sam asked, his voice hoarse. Vance answered simply, because someone did that for me once. Sam swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between Vance and the piece of paper. But he wasn't the only one noticing. Around them, a few looks of discomfort began to show, as if no one could believe what was happening. Sam stared at the piece of paper in Vance's hand, as if it were a puzzle he couldn't solve. He was used to things being handed out, flyers for soup kitchens, useless business cards, prayers instead of action. But this moment felt different. Finally, Sam reached out and took the paper, though he couldn't hide his skeptical glance. He unfolded it with his rough, trembling fingers from the early morning chill. The name written inside meant nothing to him. That phone number wasn't any clearer either. It could be a real way out, or just another dead end that Sam had walked down too many times. He exhaled sharply through his nose, his breath merging with the biting chill of a New Orleans morning. So, is that it? He looked up at JD Vance, his voice low yet laced with suspicion. No dollar? Huh? A few people in the small crowd standing nearby snorted, one guy muttering something under his breath, while a man in a baseball cap standing near a lamppost adjusted his phone, clearly still recording. Vance stood motionless, his voice unnervingly calm. Does a dollar really help you? Sam let out a dry, harsh laugh, as brittle as the wind blowing through the cobbled streets. It won't make me any worse, right? Vance maintained his steady gaze on him. But it doesn't change anything either. Sam tightened his jaw, his eyes flashing with a trace of irritation. Hey, I'm not asking you to play the savior. I'm just asking for $1. Another snort echoed from the crowd. An older woman standing a few steps away shook her head and murmured, "Just give him his money already, man." But Vance paid no mind to the murmurs. His eyes remained fixed on Sam, his voice gentle yet resolute. "You said you used to work, didn't you? A plumber?" Sam drew a deep breath and exhaled heavily. "Yeah, so what?" Vance pulled his phone out of his jacket pocket, his fingers lightly gliding over the screen. "I know someone. He runs a contracting company in Baton Rouge. He's always in need of workers, and he's willing to give those who need a second chance a shot." Sam squinted, looking at him with deep skepticism. "You're serious?" Vance nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I make one phone call, you go there, work, and get paid. No nonsense." The crowd began to stir. The kid in the hoodie whispered something excitedly to his friend. A man standing by the curb, who had been silently watching from the start, shook his head and muttered, "What a politician, always putting on a show." Sam let out another dry laugh, his eyes lighting up with a hint of sarcasm. "Let me get this straight. I ask for $1 and you jump in to offer me a job?" Vance's expression didn't change. "I'm trying to open a door for you." Sam stared at him for a long moment without speaking, his hand clenching the scrap of paper as if he wanted to crush it. He felt every gaze converge on him, curious, judgmental, expectant, as if he were the protagonist in a play he never wanted to star in. They waited to see if he would nod or turn away, if he would thank or yell at Vance. Then, a voice cut through the crowd, sharp as a knife slicing through the air. "What kind of farce is this?" That voice came from a man of about 40, standing near the edge of the sidewalk with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. His face was etched with skeptical wrinkles, his mouth twisted in displeasure. He's not asking for a job. He just wants $1? Just a cheap cup of coffee. Do you think a guy living on the streets can just go about working like a normal person? A few others nodded, murmuring their agreement in small waves. Vance didn't take his eyes off Sam. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice low but challenging. Sam's mouth was dry, his fingers trembling at his sides. He had been trapped in this vicious cycle for so long that he wasn't sure he could dare to dream of anything different. The scrap of paper in his hand felt like a small flame, both warming and burning. And then he did something no one expected. His fingers curled tightly around the paper, as if it were something precious he feared losing, even though he could hardly believe it might belong to him. His breath grew heavy in his chest. A job. A real opportunity. Not just a scrap of dollar or a pitiful look of pity. Something far greater. Yet the weight of the gazes around him, from those with houses, warm beds, lives that had never known begging for a single dollar, made his skin crawl uncomfortably. "Are you planning to take it?" The man with the canvas bag interjected, his voice as sharp as a knife, blending skepticism with irritation. Sam glared at him, his eyes blazing. "What's it got to do with you anyway?" The man snorted, shifting the bag on his shoulder. "What's it got to do with me? I see plenty of folks like you, always with an excuse, always complaining that nothing is good enough." Sam's jaw tightened, his voice rasping. "Hey, what do you know about me to start judging?" The man laughed dryly, his tone bitter. "I know you haven't lifted a finger to work all year. I know you're standing here asking for money instead of taking care of yourself. And I bet you wouldn't dare take that opportunity if it were offered to you." He shook his head, his eyes glinting harshly. "Because if you do, you'll run away as soon as things get a little tough." Those words hit Sam like a punch to the gut, stronger than he cared to admit. His hand clenched the scrap of paper even tighter, as if he wanted to slap the man, to tell him he didn't know a damn thing. But deep inside, a small corner of Sam wondered, was he even strong enough? Could he wake up early, overcome his perpetual fatigue, go there and prove himself? Or was this just another empty promise, another failure to add to his self-reproach? He turned to look at Vance, his eyes a jumble of conflicting emotions. What if this is a scam? What if I get there and nothing's waiting for me? Vance didn't blink. "Then you call me." Sam squinted, his voice taut. Called you? Vance nodded, raising his phone. I don't just give out my number to anyone. But if you go there and they have no work for you, just call me. I'll find another way. A murmur ran through the crowd. The kid in the hoodie whispered to his friend, "Oh my God, is this for real?" The man with the canvas bag snorted briefly but stayed silent, saying nothing more. Sam felt his heart pounding wildly in his chest, like a drum echoing through the cobblestone streets of New Orleans on a chilly October morning. Everything was too real, too close, so much so that he could hardly breathe. He had grown accustomed to being brushed past, with people's eyes avoiding him as if he were an invisible shadow. But now, a job, a lifeline, had suddenly appeared before him, one that both excited him and filled him with utter terror. He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "I don't even have a phone." JD Vance wasted no time. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small black phone, the kind used temporarily, simple, and handed it to Sam. "Now you have one." The surrounding crowd suddenly fell as silent as a sheet. A few audible gasps could be heard, and someone murmured, "Oh my God, I can't believe it." Sam stared intently at the phone, his eyes wide as if it were a strange object that had fallen from the sky. His breath came in short, uneven bursts. No one had ever done something like this for him. Never before. The weight of the moment pressed on his shoulders like a strong gust of wind blowing in from the bay. And then, just as the atmosphere seemed to have stretched to its limit, a voice rang out from the crowd, sharp as a knife cutting through the fog. "It's all just for show." Sam clutched the phone tightly, his heart just beginning to hold a glimmer of hope, suddenly constricting at that accusation. The speaker was an old man, about 50, with a tousled salt and pepper beard and a worn, faded flannel shirt. He folded his arms and looked at Vance with a face as hard as stone. "What kind of political farce is this?" His voice was laced with doubt, almost snarling. "The cameras are rolling, everyone's watching, and suddenly you turn into a hero saving a homeless man? When the lights go out, will you still care?" Murmurs spread through the crowd. A few people nodded in agreement, while others hesitated, glancing around. Vance met the old man's gaze without a hint of wavering. "Do you think I'm doing this just to get attention?" The old man snorted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Isn't that what all politicians do?" Sam glanced back and forth between the two, his stomach twisting as if in knots. He didn't want to believe that this was merely a performance. Didn't want to think he was just a puppet in someone's play. But that doubt, familiar as an old friend, rose up, seeping into every corner of his thoughts. Vance didn't raise his voice or offer flowery justifications. He simply said, in a deep, calm tone, "What I'm doing today doesn't change just because someone is watching. If you think so, it's because you've seen a different world, not me." The old man in the flannel remained silent for a moment, then shook his head and muttered something unpleasant before turning and walking away, his hunched shoulders blending into the crowd. Then a woman in the crowd spoke up next, her voice light yet sharp. "So what now?" Sam blinked, realizing the question was aimed at him. It echoed in his chest like the melancholy saxophone from some distant corner. He had a phone, a number, an opportunity. But did he dare to take it? He licked his dry, chapped lips and glanced at the small phone in his hand once more before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "I guess I'll try calling," he murmured, his voice soft yet audible. It was the smallest step he could take, just one phone call, one first ray of light. Vance nodded slightly. "That's all you need?" Sam shifted uncomfortably, moving his weight from one foot to the other. "What if I mess everything up?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Just try again," Vance replied, his voice steady as if nailed down. Sam exhaled slowly, his breath merging with the chilly air. He didn't know whether this would change his life, whether it was real or just another dream about to vanish. But for the first time in years, he had something, a name, a phone number, a phone, and perhaps, just perhaps, a chance to start over. Vance stepped back, giving him space to breathe. Without pressure, without theatrics, leaving only a silent truth suspended in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone's camera was turned off. A few people walked away, shaking their heads, still murmuring debates over whether what had just happened was real or merely a performance. But for Sam, that didn't matter. Their opinions weren't the issue. The question was whether he had the strength to fight for himself once more. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders a little, and walked away. This time with something in his pocket that wasn't just an empty promise. Not every opportunity comes as we expect, and many times they don't come at all. But when someone reaches out and says, "I see you," the hardest part isn't accepting their hand. It's believing that you deserve it. Maybe Sam would make that phone call, maybe he wouldn't. But the lesson here isn't in a guaranteed outcome, but in what happens when we stop thinking that a person is hopeless and begin to treat them as if they still have value. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to share your thoughts about the story and let us know which city you're watching from. We'd love for you to share its message by liking and sharing it with your friends, helping us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to us and allows us to create more meaningful stories for you. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in our next story.